It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning, everyone. This week marks the 81st anniversary of the United States' actual first use of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. It dropped another one 3 days later on Nagasaki. Today, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, France, China, the United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. And, of course, nuclear weapons are more in the news than usual this year with the war in Iran. One of the rationales for all the death and destruction in this war is that Iran, out of all the countries in the world, because of the militancy of its regime, would be especially likely to actually use a nuclear weapon if it had one, as well as use that possibility as a background threat to intimidate enemies during more conventional warfare. That's one of the rationales for this war. But what would it actually take for Iran or its biggest enemy, Israel, or any other country to decide to actually pull the nuclear trigger in today's world, knowing what we know about the likely effects? And what are the best ways to prevent those scenarios? With us for this, Fred Kaplan, author of 2 relevant books, The Wizards of Armageddon, first published in 1983, described as the untold story of the small group of men who devised the plans and shaped the policies on how to use the bomb, and his book, The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. That one is a history of American nuclear weapons policy, including analyses of presidents' actions from Truman all the way to Trump, published in 2021. Fred also writes the War Stories column for Slate and is a frequent guest on military affairs here. Fred, thanks for coming on for this. Welcome back to WNYC.
Well, thanks for asking me.
How was the decision made to actually use an atomic bomb at the end of World War II? Who considered what kinds of moral and military trade-offs?
Well, in a strange way, there was no decision to use the bomb. There was a decision to build the bomb, and once it was ready to be used, it was used. And once a second bomb came down the line, it was used. There was no separate decision, okay, now do we go ahead after destroying Hiroshima to drop a second bomb on Nagasaki? No, it kind of was in lockstep.
It was in lockstep. Why was it that simple, considering the way we think about nuclear weapons used today?
Well, nobody thought about nuclear weapons much back then, except for a couple dozen of the scientists who were working on it. There was some debate high up within the Truman administration. The bomb was built. The origins of this, let's go back to that. In 1939, Albert Einstein sent a note to President Roosevelt, saying the Germans are working on an atom bomb. It would be incredibly destructive. We should start building one as well to deter them or defeat them first. Okay, Germany surrenders in the spring of 1945. Japan is still in the war, and we're about to send a lot of troops to invade the Japanese island. The war in the Pacific has been just savage, absolutely brutal. The estimate at the time was that about 30,000 American troops would die if they invaded the island of Japan. So here you have this big bomb that was ready to go, and the operative question was not, why should we use this, but why not? Things like radiation and a prospect of a nuclear arms race and things like that, they weren't considered. Now there was some consideration, actually, because of a letter that was written by Leo Szilard, one of the Manhattan Project scientists, who in fact wrote Einstein's letter under Einstein's signature to Roosevelt, saying, look, let's have how about a demonstration of this bomb's destructiveness out in the middle of the ocean everybody watches as a warning of what could happen if you don't surrender. And there was some serious thought of that. And the argument was, well, look, what if that bomb is a dud? What if it doesn't go off? Then any bomb that we drop after that is going to have less effect because the Japanese might think, well, that one worked, but the first one didn't, so let's keep going. They also doubted whether just the appearance of a bomb from a distance would really have any impact. Uh, and it's also it's unclear really whether Truman himself, who, by the way, when he was Roosevelt's vice president, was never even told about the Manhattan Project. He didn't learn about the Manhattan Project until several days after he took over after Roosevelt's death. It's unclear whether he even listened. He was not aware of Szilard's letter uh, urging a demonstration, and it's unclear whether he took part in any of the debates over whether to go ahead and drop it. So Truman's decision to drop the bomb was actually a decision not to stop a process that was already well in momentum.
Now, I was looking up stats for this conversation for the human toll of those bombs
Mhm.
on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The website of the U.S. National Archives says as many as 70,000 people were killed instantly in
Mhm.
Hiroshima. Those who survived the initial blast were hit with a powerful shock wave that leveled nearly every structure within a mile of the impact. The site says it was followed by intense heat that created a firestorm that engulfed the city and claimed even more lives. In Nagasaki, 3 days later, another 35,000 to 40,000 people perished, says the National Archives. So, Fred, those are staggering numbers and
Yeah.
descriptions for single attacks. No wonder you called your first book The Wizards of Armageddon. Was that death toll and those other effects about what they were expecting?
Well, here's the thing, too. People had already become inured to this kind of damage. General Curtis LeMay, who is the commander of the 21st Bomber Command, was firebombing all of Japan with incendiary weapons. In one night in March of 1945, 334 B-29 bombers dropped incendiary weapons over Tokyo, killing 84,000 people. Now, 84,000 people in one night, destroying, setting on fire about 15 square miles of the capital of Japan. When the officials in Washington, and this was going to keep going, the officials in Washington, when they were selecting the targets for the atom bomb, they deliberately left off some cities that LeMay was still set to attack so
Hmm.
that he could go ahead with his firebombing. It's not like, okay, now we're going to stop everything else and drop this atom bomb. No, everything else still kept going. LeMay was still dropping his incendiary bombs. The plans for the invasion, uh, which might have happened as early as August or September, were still going on. You know, in 1981, I interviewed General LeMay for my first book, The Wizards
Uh-huh.
of Armageddon. And he told me that Hap Arnold, the commander in chief of the Army Air Forces, asked him in the spring when the war in Japan would be over. And LeMay had his numbers guys do the math, and he came back and said the war will be over by September 1st, because by September 1st, I will have bombed every square mile in Japan. Now, LeMay didn't know about the atom bomb either at that time, but his view of warfare and the people who went into the early days of an independent U.S. Air Force, their view of warfare was you bomb everything with as big a bomb as you can, and the A bomb fit
Hmm.
into that. And so, you know, you talk about these numbers now, which sound absolutely hideous. And by the way, they're trivial compared with the kind of damage that even the smallest bomb nuclear weapons in the U.S. or Russian arsenals would inflict today.
Right,
But
and we'll
but
get
it
to
wasn't.
today.
But it
But I guess
wasn't
part of
so.
it is human nature, human psychology. We remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the nuclear or atomic attacks because they were the big ones.
Yeah.
But all these individual attacks, which might have taken place even within one day, like against Tokyo, where you say the death toll was even greater than in Hiroshima, because they were a lot of smaller things, they're not remembered by history and they don't generate the emotion in the same way, you think?
Well, that's part of it, but also it is true. It took 334 planes to drop enough bombs to kill the people in Tokyo. It was
Yeah.
one plane, one bomb. I mean, that was, the phrase we now know, shock and awe. That was incredible shock and awe. And then there was the second one in Nagasaki. What the Japanese didn't know at the time is that we didn't have a third weapon yet. A third weapon might have been used, developed a couple weeks later, after
Mm.
August
Mm-hmm.
24th. But there's an interesting question that comes up here, and this wasn't revealed until much later. Truman made a big deal of being very nonchalant about this. I didn't lose any sleep over dropping the bomb and so forth. But in fact, there is David Lilienthal, who is the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, much later published his diaries. And in 1948, 3 years after the dropping of the bomb, you said, but Truman is having a meeting with Lilienthal and his top generals, and he's saying, these weapons, they're horrible. They're not a military weapon. They kill women and children. We have to do something about this. And now Truman did two things which also seem contradictory. He approved the hydrogen bomb, which, uh, the atom bomb dropped on Japan was like 12 kilotons, the equivalent of 12,000 tons of TNT. Hydrogen bombs were megatons, the equivalent of millions of tons. He approved that, but he also took the bombs themselves out of the hands of the military and put them in the hands of the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission. For several years afterwards, the bombers that were lined up on the runways at Strategic Air Command in Omaha, ready to go, and overseas, the bombs themselves were not in the planes. They were under civilian control. And only in a crisis would they then be put in the planes. So he actually had more moral qualms about what he had been told by the military, that Hiroshima was a military target, that there were loading docks on the outside of the city, which was true, but the bombs were deliberately dropped right in the middle of the city for maximum psychological effect. So he felt a bit misled, and although he never admitted it publicly, ever, he was a bit haunted by what he had unleashed with this.
Listeners, as we acknowledge the 81st anniversaries tomorrow and Sunday of the U.S. nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you can call or text with a question or comment for Fred Kaplan, author of The Wizards of Armageddon, about the men who developed those World War II bombs. And that description on the publisher's website does say the men, because I guess it was all men who developed those World War
Yeah,
II
there
bombs.
weren't any women at that point. It's true.
And The Bomb, his more recent book, subtitled Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War, which runs right up through Donald Trump as president. 212-433 WNYC, 212-433-9692. Call or text. Fred also writes the War Stories column for Slate. Our main topic, knowing what we know about the effects of those bombings of Japan. What, if anything, would cause another country ever to use nuclear weapons again? And we'll get to that, but we'll stay on the history for another few minutes. 212-433-9692. Call or text. And Nick in Manhasset is calling in with, I think, a suggestion that not everyone in the government approved of the idea even before the bombs were dropped. Nick, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Yes, good morning. Mr. Kaplan, I read that Dwight Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur both opposed the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Can you confirm that? And also, what did George Marshall think of using the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
At the time, I'm not even sure Eisenhower or MacArthur would have known about it. Uh, as for Marshall, uh, he was among those who opposed the demonstration attack. Uh, but although there was one other thing, and this is also interesting, Truman was so horrified when he learned the effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He said that he did not want a third bomb to be used automatically if Japan didn't surrender. And as a result, Marshall told Leslie Groves, General Groves, the commander of the Manhattan Project, not to send the third bomb, across the water to be dropped unless Truman explicitly uh, ordered it. So that's also an interesting fact. But we have to, there are two ways to look at history. One from the point of view of what we know now, morally, politically, everything else. And the other is from the point of view of what people at the time knew and what they were thinking and how they were affected by other things going on. And, it's very easy to look back and say, oh, this was horrible. People should have known this. An arms race was then set in motion. Nobody really thought the Russians, even after Hiroshima, the common view is that the Russians wouldn't develop this thing for decades. Well, they built an atom bomb within 4 years. Then they built a hydrogen bomb a few years after that. Uh,
But getting back for a second
yeah.
to what you said about the reluctance to drop a third bomb, listener asked in a text, why was the second A bomb dropped only 3 days after Hiroshima? Why not give the Japanese a week or so to fully realize what had happened? What's the historical answer to that listener?
Well, see, nobody really, I don't know about nobody, but the general thinking was not that this was the absolute weapon or something like that. Everything that had been going on the day before Hiroshima continued apace the day after Hiroshima. In other words, the training for the invasion kept going. LeMay kept doing his incendiary bombing. And so the first weapon was dropped. Here comes the second weapon. It was dropped. There was also, there's been some interesting scholarship in the years since.
But
The
did they
Japanese,
know? Did they know how bad it was in Hiroshima by 3 days later?
no, no, I don't think so. I mean, it took only months later did people go survey on the ground what was going on. It's not like we had uh, spy planes or satellites, reading license plates up from the sky. We didn't have any agents on the ground. If we had, they would have been killed. There wasn't direct communication, so no, it wasn't.
Okay.
It was known. There were pictures right away of the mushroom cloud. There were pictures right away that, if you look at, say, the New York Times story at the day after, that we're aware that, oh, something new is happening here. This is going to transform the nature of warfare. We've never seen anything like this. The pilots themselves reported the shockwave that they felt after dropping it. But in terms of what was going on the ground, that was later, and it certainly wasn't within the first few days. And there was no presumption that, well, if we drop this bomb over Hiroshima, the Japanese might surrender right away. Very few people thought that was going to happen. You built two weapons, the shock of the invasion of Pearl Harbor, and again, the war in the Pacific was just, just
So deadly
savagery
for
we
so
have
many
not
people.
seen in modern
Yeah.
times.
Let me
So
take a
on both
caller who
sides.
wants to stay on kind of this point, right in that sort of 3 day period. Anne in Briarwood, Queens, you're on WNYC. Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for calling in.
It's just,
Anne, do we have you? Anne is listening to her radio on delay. We'll give her a few seconds. I will tell you that she told us her age, 89, and that she remembers the dropping of these bombs on Japan. Anne, you there? Can you hear me? Listen to your phone, not the radio. No, you didn't. No, you didn't. We're here. All right. You know what? Talk to Ann. Get her ready off the air. We're going to go to another caller. We'll try to come back to Ann. Jerry in Paramus, a World War II vet. Jerry, you're on WNYC. Thank you for calling in.
Oh, Brian, thank you very much for taking my call. Yes, I am a World War II vet. I'm 102 years old.
Whoa.
And the dropping of the atom bomb had a very positive effect on me because I was, at that time, fighting in France and Germany in the European theater. And after Germany surrendered, I was stationed with the Evac hospital in Mainz, Germany, and we were told that we're going to have to be redeployed to the Pacific area, and this was this was in July of '45, and we were told to pack up and go back to Le Havre and wait for transportation. Well, it took us a couple of months to pack all our material, and we got back to Le Havre, and we're waiting for ships. And on August, I think the 3rd or the 4th, I'm not sure, there was tremendous jubilation. Everyone was yelling and shouting and screaming and jumping around. We were told that the A-bomb was dropped. So obviously, we did not have to be redeployed to the Pacific. I just wanted to mention that because it affected me tremendously.
Yes.
And I just wanted to share that with everyone.
Do you look at it any differently today with all these years of history now, in between then and now, and what we know now about nuclear weapons or even what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima?
Well, Brian, at that time we were all involved in our own safety, in our own security. And we knew that after being in the European theater, we survived. We wanted to continue to survive. So dropping the A-bomb was a tremendous relief.
Mm-hmm. And that's how it sticks with you today. Jerry, we really appreciate you calling in. Quite a story from a 102-year-old, Fred, and I guess it really represents what you were describing earlier.
Well, I do remember my parents had a very good friend of my parents was stationed in the Pacific, and he would have been part of that invasion force. And so, he had the same point of view. But Brian, even from a higher point of view, let's say you're in the White House, or the War Department, as it was called at the time, and you read this letter from Leo Szilard warning of the, quote, political and social problems that this new weapon might cause in the coming years and decades. And you weigh that against the possibility that dropping this bomb might mean you don't have to launch this invasion that's going to kill at least 30,000 American soldiers in a war that's been going on for 4 years and is doing just devastation across the world. Are you really, and again, this is from the point of view of back then, are you really going to say, well, no, I've got to pay attention to these political and social problems that might happen in the next few decades rather than the war that's going on right now? Even obviously the caller, his life was on the line. But, even from a more quote unquote strategic point of view, it's hard to imagine any leader saying, well, I'm gonna take this from 10,000 feet up in 30 years in the future. It's very hard to take it from that kind of perspective.
And before we get to the second half of this conversation, which is going to be about the present and the potential for actual nuclear weapons use in the conflict between Iran and Israel or any other country today, one question to cover the last 81 years. How close do you think the U.S. or Soviet Union, of course there was the whole nuclear arms race during the whole Cold War, or India and Pakistan, who people have been afraid might actually use a nuclear bomb one against the other, or anyone else, how close has any country ever come to actually making that decision again?
Well, no, both during the Berlin crisis of 1961, there are now transcripts and tapes of Kennedy and his advisors talking seriously about using nuclear weapons if the Soviets occupied West Berlin or invaded West Germany. And they were threatening to occupy West Berlin by the end of the year. 1962, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Uh, there were Russian nuclear missiles 90 miles away. Uh, and also there were several times since that we now know, computer errors. It looks like 100 Russian ICBMs are coming across the horizon. Turns out to be a software error or a flock of geese. There were similar errors from the Soviet and Russian point of view. In 1983, the U.S. was staging a very, very large exercise of transitioning from conventional to nuclear war in Europe. And there was a NATO Warsaw Pact war. And an intelligence board concluded that the Soviets at that time really did believe that the United States was preparing to launch a preemptive first strike. And if they had kept thinking that, in retrospect, there was worry, would they have launched a preemptive strike to preempt our preemptive strike? So, we have these weapons, thousands of them. And look, I remember once, and I've asked this of other people, but Daniel Ellsberg, who, later became an anti-nuclear activist, but in the late 50s, early 60s, he was a hawk, like most people were. He was a Cold Warrior. There was a Cold War going on. And I said, when you were 30 years old in 1960, and if I asked you back then, what is the chance that in the next 50 years, no country would use a nuclear weapon? What would you say the chances of that were? And he said, oh, probably 0%. It was assumed that there would someday be a war, that it would escalate to nuclear weapons. And so what do we do about that? This was for many, many years, well into the 70s, nuclear weapons were at the heart of United States war planning. It was not, if there was going to be a war against the Soviet Union or China, it was assumed that this would go nuclear at some point. Really not until the 80s. And so this became the centerpiece of our strategy. I mean, as late as the 1980s. Remember when Reagan and Gorbachev met at Reykjavik and almost struck that agreement to get rid of all of their nuclear weapons? I know for a fact that Helmut Kohl, who was the Chancellor of West Germany, as it was called at the time, called Richard Burt, who was our ambassador there, in a panic. Is Reagan really going to get rid of all of our nuclear weapons? That's our nuclear umbrella. That is the security that we hold. It was thought at the time the Soviets were thought to have conventional superiority in Europe. The nuclear weapons were there to counter that. And in fact, now we have conventional superiority in Europe. And, Russia still has 2,000 so-called tactical nuclear weapons in Western Russia to deter United States and NATO action in Europe. So,
and we will more squarely, we're up against a break, but we will more squarely talk about the present, including the difference between so-called tactical nuclear weapons and what we generally think of as the big one, and definitely in the context of the war that's taking place in the Middle East right now, which from the U.S. perspective and Israeli perspective is very much about stopping one country from having nuclear weapons by two countries that actually have them. Stay with us. Brian Lehrer on WNYC as we continue with Fred Kaplan, who writes the War Stories column for Slate and wrote the books about nuclear weapons called The Wizards of Armageddon and The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. This is the 81st anniversary week of the U.S. using those weapons in World War II. On Hiroshima 81 years ago tomorrow, and Nagasaki 81 years ago 3 days later. Fred, in the period since the Cold War, to bring it to the present, North Korea have been the main focus of Western nuclear fears, I think on the premise that the rulers of those countries just might be crazy enough or radical enough to use them. North Korea actually has the bomb, Iran does not at this point. Let's leave North Korea aside for now. Is there any meaningful intelligence that says what, if anything, would lead Iran to use a nuclear weapon if it had one?
Well, a confession, Brian, it's quite possible that there's meaningful intelligence that I don't have access to.
That's always fair.
But that said, I mean, President Trump has said, you know, if I hadn't taken out those enriched uranium sites last summer, Iran, not only would Iran have a nuclear weapon, but Israel would be destroyed now. And that's just kind of ridiculous. For one thing, Israel is known to have about 200 nuclear weapons. If Iran, I mean, one thing that would incite Israel to launch nuclear weapons is if Iran launched nuclear weapons at Israel. I think the reason why Iran wants to have nuclear weapons is as a deterrent against Israel's nuclear weapons. That's one thing. And second, as a backup, as sort of additional leverage to their own conventional aggression and intimidation. If you're invading another country or intimidating another country, to a degree that it might prompt some kind of retaliation, and you've got nuclear weapons in your back pocket, then you are kind of deterring the other side's deterrent. The other side, for example, let's take the first Gulf War. If Saddam Hussein was working on a nuclear bomb, if he had actually had nuclear weapons at the time that he invaded Kuwait, I don't think that the U.S. would have been able to amass a coalition of 30 countries to push back that invasion of Kuwait because they would have feared that he would have responded by using nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
So,
well, there hasn't been the pressure by the West to limit or abandon the programs of other nuclear countries that there has been on North Korea or Iran or back then Iraq. Not on India or Pakistan or Israel, not even China. Why not?
Well, China, I mean, they started developing a bomb in 1964. And there was, we now see in the archives, there was serious talk within the Johnson administration. You know, what do we do about this? You know, Mao Zedong was seen as kind of a crazy guy. And should we go in and preempt? Should we launch a preemptive attack on China? And it was basically concluded that no, we can deter them. We can deter a China bomb. Don't worry about it. As for many other countries, you know, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1969. And not only that, but the United States was, at the time, at least a half-credible leader of certain alliances. Now, France, Charles de Gaulle said, you know, I really don't think an American president is going to risk New York to save Paris, so I'm going to build my own nuclear arsenal. And I think one reason why other countries, you know, in 1960 it was predicted that by the year 2000, 20 countries would have a nuclear weapon. Why hasn't that happened? 20 countries have the technical capability to do that. One reason why it hasn't happened is because people kind of shut their eyes, held their breath, and said, well, we've got the United States nuclear umbrella protecting us. If this nuclear umbrella is in doubt, which indeed it is now, that's why you see leaders, politicians in South Korea, even Japan, talking about maybe we need to start thinking about building our own nuclear bomb because we can't rely on the Americans anymore. You have France talking about expanding the size of its nuclear arsenal to provide coverage for non-nuclear countries in Europe. Uh,
Yeah.
it's become a lot more complicated than
So
it
there's
was.
all this pressure now on Iran. In the
Yes.
case, including, a war in which many people, including some American service members, are dying for the cause. In the case of Israel, critics say, look what they are willing to do militarily in their defense. And that should bring about disarmament pressure or some kind of pressure from the West as well. The argument is, look especially at current events after October 7th, 2023, without getting into the, war crimes or genocide debate. The number of civilian deaths they are willing to inflict in the name of their self-defense and the popularity of the war among the populace, coupled with the opposition to Israel thinking, to thinking that Israel shouldn't even exist as a country or a Jewish state right now, and that growing, could lead one to think that they might be especially at risk of deploying nuclear weapons, say if their backs were against the wall in a conventional war, like you described, various scenarios. Have you reported on that possibility at all, the calculus for Israel that their politicians and generals might be having compared to their existential enemy, Iran, or any other nuclear power?
Well, it's hard to gauge because even though everybody knows that Israel has about 200 nuclear weapons, officially they don't talk about it at all. And in fact, if you are a nuclear weapons scientist in Israel and you publicly talk about anything, even acknowledging that there is an Israeli nuclear arsenal, I mean, it's a felony. You could go to jail for the rest of your life for this. So it's hard to talk about this when nobody even talks about the basics. But there's a very interesting thing here, and you raise an interesting point. It used to be thought that countries with nuclear weapons, that it deters not only a nuclear attack, but even a non-nuclear attack or an attack of any sort by countries that don't have nuclear weapons. And that's not true anymore. In the early stages of the Russia-Ukraine war, President Biden didn't want you to give Ukraine weapons that had the range to strike Russia because it was thought that that would cross a Rubicon. Russia might respond by using nuclear weapons, World War III. And in fact, there was what they called exquisite intelligence, meaning presumably communications intercepts or an inside spy, that at that moment early on in the war when Ukraine was really fighting back and pushing back Russian forces, there was serious talk in Putin's inner circle of stopping them by using nuclear weapons. Now, that hasn't happened. Ukraine is now striking targets in Russia. They even struck some nuclear bombers in Russia. Iran is striking American targets in Jordan, is striking Israeli weapons targets, military targets from which they probably got the intelligence locations from Russia. And yet nuclear weapons, nobody's even talking about using nuclear. Now, why? There's a woman named Nita Tannenwald, I think she's at Brown. She wrote a book in 1999 called The Nuclear Taboo. It was very controversial at the time, and she posited the idea that there's a taboo about nuclear weapons that kind of wipes out traditional views of deterrence. And maybe this is keeping people from using nuclear weapons. And more recently, just in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, Rose Gottenmoeller, who is a former arms control negotiator, wrote an article called The Strange Defeat of Nuclear Deterrence. She notes this trend of non-nuclear weapons attacking nuclear states and not facing devastation as a result.
Mm-hmm.
And she makes the point, maybe, and now she has her own motive here. This article is directed at countries thinking about going nuclear, saying, listen, don't build a nuclear bomb. It doesn't really help you that much anyway.
Because nobody's actually going to be that stupid and
right.
crazy
Nobody's
as
going
to
to do
use them?
it doesn't add to your credibility. It only adds to your vulnerability. And one reason why the U.S. and Russia and even India and Pakistan haven't fired nuclear weapons at each other is that, we've built pretty reliable, not fully reliable, but pretty reliable early warning systems. We have hotlines. The nuclear weapons are under lock and key pretty securely. Of Iran and Saudi Arabia and who
Yeah.
knows what other countries start building nuclear weapons. It takes a while to build up this kind of
Is it also a factor,
apparatus.
though, with respect to the Mideast, Iran and Israel, that in an area dense with multiple countries, like that region, is
Hmm.
fallout from any nuclear attack a major deterrent in itself? If Israel, small geographically, dropped a bomb on any country nearby, or if Iran did, despite having more square miles, would it be a risk to their own people?
Well, two things. First, nuclear weapons now, they've been able to make them much smaller than the multi-megaton hydrogen bombs of the old days. But
Is this
even
what they call
so,
tactical nuclear weapons?
yeah, that's part of it. But we developed a few years ago something called a low yield warhead for our Trident submarines. The low yield warhead was 8 kilotons. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was 12 and a half kilotons. Not much difference. And you're right. You know, the, yeah, and depending which way the wind blows, absolutely. A bomb that Israel drops on even Iran, but certainly any other country in the Middle East, the fallout could
Hmm.
spread right back to Israel, or certainly to UAE, Oman, Jordan, other countries. I remember in the days of NATO Warsaw Pact confrontation, there was this area in West Germany called the Folded Gap. This is where the Soviet tank onslaught was going to happen because it was this clear and open area where great for tank warfare. They would just wiggle, just go maneuver right across West German terrain. And I once, in the early 80s, no, I guess late 70s, I was in a NATO helicopter flying over the Fulda Gap. And I looked out the window and there was no gap anymore. There were villages, there were towns, they'd sprung up. Any war in Europe, whether using just conventional weapons and certainly tactical nuclear weapons, would have killed lots of civilians. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
unavoidable. There
What
there just aren't any clear and open areas anymore for warfare to happen independent of effects on the population.
One more call. Kathleen in Brooklyn. You're on WNYC. Hello, Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Brian. Longtime listener, first-time caller. My name is Kathleen Sullivan. I work with Robert Kroonquist in a project that brings atomic bomb survivors to share their firsthand witness with New York City high school students through our project Youth Hearts New York. We're also part of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for our work helping to broker the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Would love to come on to your show and talk more about that. There's loads of experts that live in the New York metro area. The reason that I called in is because I wanted to problematize this idea of use. We say that nuclear weapons were only used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when, in fact, nuclear weapons have been used thousands of times through nuclear testing across our planet. This year, we mark the 80th anniversary of the advent of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, where 67 atmospheric nuclear bombs destroyed that atoll region. The Bikini Atoll is still too contaminated for people to return to. The Runit Dome, which was basically a crater where the U.S. government left loads of nuclear materials, capped it with concrete, is cracking. There's the issue of climate chaos and rising seas. And the U.S. government is saying to the Marshallese people, the Runit Dome is their problem. We're also seeing the 60th anniversary since the French started nuclear testing in Mahonui, French Polynesia. And there is not one county in one state you just mentioned fallout, Brian. There's not one county in one state that doesn't have a radioactive isotopic footprint that leads back to nuclear testing at the Nevada test site. And don't believe me, you can read the excellent work of Sebastian Philippe, who just won a MacArthur Award for his dose reconstruction on nuclear testing in many parts of the world.
I'm so glad you brought testing into it, because I hear what you say about problematizing the word use, that these were, in certain real terms, uses. So what's the main policy goal of your group, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, at this point? Is it kind of reparations for the people of Bikini Atoll and elsewhere where there was testing? Is it something along the lines of prevention? What's your main policy goal?
The policy goal of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is to abolish nuclear weapons. We have over 100, we have 100 ratifying nations to the treaty. The nuclear armed and nuclear adjacent nations are not among them. But very key to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons are Articles 6 and 7, which are the positive obligations of the treaty, which seek to build a trust fund to remediate contaminated environments to the best of our ability and also offer victims assistance. But the key thrust of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is that the world is not safe with nuclear weapons in them. And we in this country, where in the buildup of nuclear weapons, as I mentioned, through the Nevada test site, we're harming our own people in pursuit of nuclear weapons. There's a group in the Tularosa Basin near the Trinity site where the world's first nuclear weapon was ever exploded in the White Sands of New Mexico. They're now looking at 5 generations of cancers as a direct result of fallout from the Trinity test, which was a plutonium device. And those cancers and that ill health had not occurred before in their communities. Okay. And of course, they also speak to the lie that, they used that site in New Mexico because nobody lived there. There were thousands of people in the path of the fallout. And again, Sebastian Philippe has done a masterful job on a dose reconstruction of the fallout, specifically from the Trinity site and how it spread throughout our nation.
Kathleen, thank you for your call. A good way to end this segment, marking the 81st anniversary of the United States' actual first military use in war, let's say, of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. It dropped another 3 days later on Nagasaki, and we thank our guest, Fred Kaplan, author of 2 relevant books, The Wizards of Armageddon and The Bomb, Presidents, Generals, and the Secret History of Nuclear War. Fred, thank you very much.
Sure, anytime.